have 6 sessions together, today and tomorrow, and then Sunday through Wednesday next week. Given my background, since I'm a philosopher, logician, what concerns me is whether being a believing Jew is something that we have good reason for. Not everybody's concerned with that. Some people are looking for a way of life that serves their general hopes, creates a quality of living that they find valuable. Some people are concerned to be able to defend, justify, give reasons for what they believe. That's my line of work. So I would like to share with you at least what can be done in 6 days, why it's reasonable to be a believing Jew. And I want to start with revelation at Sinai, because without Sinai, there is no Judaism. As you all know, Judaism is, among other things, a religion of commandments. There are no commandments unless there's a commander and unless he expressed himself about what he wants us to do, communicated with us. Without that, there are no commandments. And I think it's well known, Judaism is unique in all the religions of the world that starts with a national revelation. The story of Jewish history, the story that the Jewish religion tells about itself, features very prominently a national revelation. Every other religion starts with a story that so-and-so is special in some way. This recalls the old Hasidic parable. Hasidic Rebbe died, and he had 2 sons, and each son said that he should be the new leader of the group. And there was some competition for a while, until one day one of the sons presented himself to the group and said, I know that I'm the right choice because our father of blessed memory came to me last night in a dream and told me that I'm the right one. To which one of the senior members said, if your father had wanted to prove that you are the right choice, he shouldn't have come to you in a dream. He should have come to us in a dream. That would prove it. And the same story can be told about any religion that starts with a story that so-and-so is special. So-and-so is a prophet, or so-and-so is the son of God, or so-and-so can out-meditate anyone on the planet, if you want Buddhism, or as long as the story told about an individual, the public has to decide whether to believe him or not. It's a story that everyone hears it directly, so then no one is called upon to make up his mind whether it's plausible or not. That's why Judaism is unique in the story that it tells. Now the question is, do we have reason to accept that story as true? Yes, we have a unique position in our belief system, in our story. But what we'd like to know is whether there's adequate reason to believe that the story is true. Now, long and frustrating experience has taught me that if I launch into the reasons and we don't agree beforehand what counts as adequate reason, we end up talking at cross purposes. I present reasons and you say they're not good enough, and I try to argue that they are good enough. I think we need to start with a brief discussion. What counts as a good enough reason to make up your mind that something's true? If we can agree on what counts as a good enough reason, then when I present the reasons, presumably we have a good chance of agreeing whether it is a good enough reason or it isn't a good enough reason. So let's start there. What counts as a good enough reason? Here's a dialogue which I think takes place quite commonly, and I think we need to meditate on. A says, I know. B says, how do you know? And A says, well, because of PQR. And B says, PQR? That's your reason? Think. Even if PQR is correct, you still might be wrong. You haven't nailed it. You haven't proven it. And A says, golly, I guess you're right. My reason is PQR, but doesn't nail it for sure. There isn't really a proof. And B says, then you don't know. To know something, you have to prove it. And if you can't prove it, you don't know it. I think that's a common sort of conversation that people have. I think it's very intuitive, and I think it's very wrong. It's very wrong. Proof is not the right goal. Proof is not the right standard. It's too strict. Demanding proof is too strict. We're looking for adequate reason to explain adequate reason. To mean proof is not a good explanation of adequate reason. I want to show you why I think that's true. First of all, because, strictly speaking, you can't prove anything. Let's see. Can you prove who your parents are? You believe they're your parents because they told you. And you believe them. How quaint. Couldn't it be that you're adopted and they didn't tell you? That does happen. Small minority of cases, but it does happen. So you say, but look, I look just like my parents. You know why that is? Because when they went to the orphanage 22 years ago, they took their baby pictures with them. And they looked for a baby that looked like their baby pictures. And that's why you look like that. So you say, I did a DNA test. Well, of course, I know you did not. And number two, let's suppose you did a DNA test. How would you know for sure that your parents, or maybe I should say those people, didn't pay off the lab to lie to you about the results? How do you know that? How could you pin that down for sure? I don't think there's anything you could do to pin down for sure, infallibly, with a proof that they are your parents. Still, I'm not suggesting you should doubt it. I'm not suggesting that you should cut your relations with them or treat them like everybody else. I think proof is the wrong standard. Proof is asking for too much. Some philosophers, with their imaginations, illustrated this in extreme examples. Descartes, who started this whole ball rolling 350 years ago, asked, do you know that you're not dreaming at this very moment? Right now. How would you know for sure? How could you prove that you're not dreaming at this very moment? Pinch yourself? You could pinch yourself in a dream. Maybe you're hoping it's true and you'll wake up someplace else. I don't know. Or Bertrand Russell, picking up the theme 120 years ago, asked, can you prove that the universe is more than 5 minutes old? 5 minutes old. Maybe you've heard discussions about 5,775 and 13.7 billion, but 5 minutes? What would you do to prove it's 5 minutes old? So you say, I remember yesterday. Maybe you came into existence 5 minutes ago with those, I guess we should say, pseudo memories convoluted in your brain, but there wasn't a yesterday? What could you do to prove it for sure? These are the foundations on which we live, that we have conscious experience and we know that we're not dreaming, that the world is more than 5 minutes old, and none of it is open to proof. Now you'll say, but what about logic and mathematics? Well, you asked the right person. My field was philosophy of mathematics. There are arguments about axioms. Different groups don't accept the same axioms in mathematics. There are arguments about logic. Different groups don't accept various principles of logic. There are arguments across the board. And even if you'll pick a principle which today everybody agrees on, you don't know whether tomorrow there'll be an argument about it. You can't predict the future. If you're looking for proof, it's too strong a demand. What you need to look for is something weaker than proof, which will be a good enough reason. Are we together so far? Did I answer your question? Good. Now, how do we do it in practical life? In practical life, we gather evidence, we experience, we read, talk to other people, and discuss and debate, and then we go with the choice that has the most support. We gather evidence, and we go with the choice that has the most support. That's how we make all of our decisions. Really important ones and less important ones. You are choosing or have chosen recently a profession. Do you know for sure that you're going to be successful in that profession? Certainly not. You don't even know whether 10 years from now that profession will exist, because the changing of the economy, changing of technology is so quick, professions disappear. When I was teaching at Hopkins in the 70s, they were creating a curriculum for the multi-career lifetime, because the majority of the students will not have one career over a lifetime. So you have to prepare them for that dislocation where the career that they have is going to disappear, they'll be retrained for something else. put something into the curriculum that would train them for that. You're going to get married. Well, I don't have to tell you about the divorce statistics. Of course, everybody says, sure, there are people who get divorced. Not me, I'm not going to get divorced. The trouble is, all the people who got divorced also said that they're not going to get divorced. And they ended up getting divorced anyhow. You're not going to know for sure. That doesn't mean you shoot blind. You get to know the person, and you interact with the person, and you have experiences together, and you talk, and you share. And then you make the best judgment that you can. That's how we live life. So I suggest that the right way to go about it is look at the evidence, experience, talk to people, compare your view with other people's views, and follow what has the most support with the evidence that you have available. That, to me, is the right way to do it, and that counts as adequate reason. Are we together so far? Yes. Okay, this is very, very important. Let me tell you why. Now I'm going to play the prophet. We're together for 6 days. Inevitably, when I lay out reasons and evidence, someone will say, but couldn't it still be wrong? Maybe it's E.T., or something else. So let me tell you at the outset, if you ask me, couldn't it still be wrong? The answer is always yes. Yes, it could be wrong. If you say maybe it's E.T., my answer is yes, maybe it is. Maybes are cheap. Maybes are just a matter of possibility. I give you all the possibilities. If you ask, isn't it possible that Q? The answer is yes, it's possible that Q. But we don't live our life on possibilities. We live our lives on probabilities. To make it probable, there has to be some positive evidence that it's correct, not merely possible. So if you feel the itch to say, but maybe, you can predict what my answer will be. It's okay to say it, but you can predict my answer. Well, maybe it was an unknown volcanic eruption? Yeah, maybe. But is there any positive reason to think it was? If not, then you haven't got a good reason to reject what I'm saying. I'm going to present positive evidence. If you want to counter what I'm doing, you need to present positive evidence on the other side. And then we can weigh up the evidence on both sides. That, I think, is the correct way to proceed. We together so far? Yep. Terrific. Okay. Now let's take a look at Sinai. I'm going to start with a number of preliminaries. I hope they're all so obvious that they're boring. Because if they're obvious and boring, then that means the foundation is very strong, very easy to agree to. Almost everything people know, they know because of what other people say. Your knowledge base about everything that happened before you were born is because somebody said so. And the population of China, the boiling point of lead, and the fact that the solar system now has 8 planets instead of 9 planets because Pluto was demoted to a dwarf planet. You read about that, and that's where your information comes from. No one can live their life saying, I don't believe it until I check it out. There are some people who say that, but if they think about it, it's not reasonable. I don't believe it until I check it out. Check it out. How did you get here? By airplane? Did you check the safety of the airplane? Surely not. Do you check the hygiene of the foods that you eat? Surely not. You're relying on what other people say, other people's testimony, all the time. Of course, not everything other people say is true. Sometimes they make honest mistakes, and sometimes they prevaricate, which is just a fancy way of saying lie. So, in order to run your life where you're absorbing information from the information sphere, you need to be selective. You need to have some way to decide what information to accept and what information not to accept. What information is worthy of being trusted and what information is not. Of course, you won't be infallible. No one's infallible. It may be worthy of being trusted and turn out to be wrong also. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica makes mistakes from time to time. But to do it blindly means it's suicide. You need to have some way to decide whether a piece of information is reasonable to accept or not. We do that by experience. We all get information from a variety of sources all the time. And we know for ourselves that sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't work out. And we keep score. How often does this source give me genuine information, and how often does it not give me genuine information? And in which subjects? And we learn that some are very trustworthy, and some are trustworthy only in some subjects, and some in other subjects. Take, for example, CNN. If they report the sports scores, or the Dow Jones Industrials, or the word-for-word speech that Obama made, I think they're probably trustworthy. If they give you an opinion piece on the Middle East, it's better to be very skeptical. Even factual reporting in the Middle East, you could be quite skeptical. Photographs don't show what they say they show. They aren't taken where they say they're taken. So you learn from experience what sources are reasonable and what sources are not. A number of years ago, CNN reported when Ariel Sharon was in the hospital here in Jerusalem on the 5th floor. It was Saturday night, and some ultra-Orthodox Jews stood on the street opposite his window, raised their eyes to his window, and chanted prayers for his recovery. Well, between you and me, they were blessing the new moon. That's what they were doing. They were there because their wives gave birth, which happens every Shabbos, and once a month on Saturday night, we bless the new moon. They had no clue he was in that building. There was no sign outside the building. Ariel Sharon was being treated here. They were looking up. Sure, they were looking up to the moon. The poor CNN fellow didn't know anything about blessing the new moon. He didn't bother to ask them, of course. Why would you ask them? So he just reported this. Well, when I read that, I say, okay. So then, in a case like that, CNN can make a mistake. Now, if you look up in history books, you can read about the first online encyclopedia, which was put out by Microsoft, called Encarta. So I'm old enough to remember that because I have lots of white hairs. Encarta had a language section where you have the name of every language. You press on it, and you get a native speaker saying something in the native language. Fine. So I press on the Hebrew button, and this is what I get. Mi shetarach b'Shabbat yochal b'Shabbat, which means he who works on Shabbos will eat on Shabbos. Does that sound right to you? That doesn't sound right to me. Actually, the original quote is Mi shetarach be'erev Shabbat u'yochal b'Shabbat. He who works on Friday will eat on Shabbos. That's the real quote. How did they get the quote? They went to Tel Aviv. They stuck a microphone under somebody's nose and said, "Say something Jewish." He thinks, what did I remember from second grade? Something like this, and got it wrong. So when I press the Swahili button, should I trust it? Maybe not. Because I know that they're sloppy about gathering information like this. So in general in life, we have to decide what information to accept. We do it on the basis of success. Now, I take it that's obvious. One step removed, where we're not talking about a particular source, we're talking about a type of source. 2 witnesses tell us they were at sea with Peter and Paul, just the 4 of them on the boat. And Peter premeditatedly pushed Paul off the boat, and the sharks ate Paul thoroughly, down to the belt buckle. They ate everything. They say Peter killed Paul. That's what they say. There's no evidence. Everything's gone. There were no videos. There's no evidence. What do? Do we say, well, you guys are just talking, we don't have any evidence, and let Peter go free? No, that isn't what we do. What we do is we investigate the witnesses. How old are they? How well educated are they? Do they have any psychological problems, disabilities, instabilities? Are they addicted to any substances, which might be a subclass of the first one? Do they have anything to gain from getting Peter in trouble? If all the answers to those questions are the right answers, they're 22 years old, they have master's degrees, they have a reasonable intelligence, which isn't presumed by having master's degrees, and they have no psychological disabilities, no addictions, and they are disinterested. They have nothing to gain from Peter going to jail. Then Peter will go to jail, because eyewitness testimony is evidence. If they're 11 years old, or they have various psychological deficits, or they're going to inherit Peter's business if he goes to jail, because there's a clause in the contract that says if he goes to jail, they get the business, then we're going to be skeptical. What are we doing? We're not taking these 2 witnesses and asking, how often have they gotten it right in the past when they testified to murder? And how often did they get it wrong in the past when they testified to murder? And make a score and talk about the reliability? That's impossible. How many people testify twice in a lifetime to murder? Doesn't happen. Can't build statistics like that. But you can say, what kind of people are they? What other people are related to their credibility? Age is important. Intelligence is important. Education is important. Psychological freedom from psychological disabilities is important. Lack of interest is important because, in experience, a person is too young, or a person is got psychological disabilities, or a person has a low intelligence. Then they don't tell the truth. They often don't tell the truth. Our experience teaches us that we can't trust people of that type. So here we're not talking about the ones who are speaking, we're talking about the type. And either the type has credibility or the type doesn't have credibility. And if the type has credibility, then we are going to trust them. Now I'm going to stress a feature which is obvious, but it's important for the application that I want to make. Remember, we're talking about Peter killing Paul where there's no other access to evidence. No one else was there, and there's no way for us to reconstruct the event. If somebody says, but there's no other evidence, that's right, exactly. All I have is the evidence of the witnesses. Still, if they're the right kind of people, we're going to trust them, and we're going to put Peter in jail. Yeah?
I'm just wondering, wouldn't it be just as bad to falsely prosecute somebody for doing so as the actual act itself? I mean, if you're just basing off a type, wouldn't there be generalizations that don't necessarily fit the particular individual?
I'm not following you.
You're trusting someone based on what type of person they are.
That's right.
So that's generalizing on what kind of person they are. They, as an individual, might not, like, just because you're assuming they're not the right kind of person, doesn't necessarily mean, so wouldn't it be isn't that just that might be just generalizing and making, if you're going to persecute him for killing Paul in this scenario.
Okay, so now.
What happens if it's a false assumption, is basically what I'm asking.
Okay, so now I'm going to call in my credentials as a prophet. You said it might be a mistake. Right. Answer, sure. Anything could be. It might be a mistake, but I have to go on the odds. Now, when we talk about convicting a person beyond a reasonable doubt, and I say, we keep statistics of this sort of thing, in the number of times we're able to check post facto a testimony like this, 999 times out of 1,000, it turns out to be correct. Then it's not reasonable to say this one is going to be the one in 1,000. It's not a reasonable doubt. So could it be wrong? Sure, it could be wrong. There are wrong convictions. But the fact that there are wrong convictions doesn't mean we should stop the court process and let everybody go free. Of the number of convictions that have been proven to be wrong, they are 0.001% of the convictions that we verify afterwards. So it's a very, very small percentage. That's one of the reasons we make the standard of evidence so high.
But that would be proof, wouldn't it? As opposed to just...
No, proof, the way I'm using the word proof, and the way I think it's used in discussion and debate, it means there's no chance of being wrong. Zero chance of being wrong. That's why the person who demands a proof, and you give your reasons, all he has to do is exercise his imagination and find a possibility. And then he's defeated you. Because if there's a possibility that you're wrong, you didn't give a proof. And I don't have that responsibility. I think that's an unreasonable responsibility. I have to present probability. Now, of course, how much probability you need will depend upon what you're going to do. We know O.J. Simpson was acquitted in the criminal trial, and he was judged guilty in the civil trial. Because in the civil trial, all you need is a majority of evidence, 50% plus epsilon. And he was clearly guilty, and they had, I don't know what you would estimate, 60, 70%, but a 30% deficit is a reasonable doubt. And a reasonable doubt, you can't put a person in jail. So we have different standards, depending on what we want to do about it. But the standards are always probability, and it depends upon the outcome. Okay, so now, let's move to Sinai. Suppose I have a kind of information, and every time that we've tested this kind of information, it's turned out to be true. Sometimes we can't test, sometimes it's hard to check, but every time we've been able to check, this kind of information has turned out to be true. And suppose Sinai is delivered by that kind of information. Then it seems to me we have very good reason to believe that Sinai is true. Now all I have to do is describe to you what kind of information I'm talking about. Here's the first slightly complicated thing I have to tell you. By the way, I start every subsequent session by a review of what I did in the previous session. 23 hours have gone by, you have time to think about it, can raise questions about it, and then after tomorrow, you'll have 4 days to think about it. And then we'll pick it up again on Sunday. So there's an overlap each time. So if you don't quite get something now, think about it, and then we can talk about it at the beginning of the next session also. We have a tradition about Sinai. It's a national tradition. For thousands of years, the entire nation accepted that tradition. And that tradition says that Sinai was a national experience. At a certain point in time, all of our ancestors, not some other nation, that's really important, all of our ancestors heard God speak. So it's a national tradition about a national experience. And it's a kind of experience that people are not likely to forget. Some experiences happen and we just let them go because they're not so important. But if you hear God speak and he commands you a Torah to live by, that's not the sort of thing that people are going to forget. These three conditions, a national tradition about a national experience, which people are not likely to forget, I call that a national experiential tradition, NET. And I tell you that in surveying NETs throughout the world, there is not a single NET of any nation anywhere that is known to be false. Not one. Not one. That means all the Greeks, or all the ancient Egyptians, or all the Chinese, all the Nigerians, or all the people in Los Angeles, which is another country, all the people have a tradition that they all accept. And the tradition about the past, the past of their group, and the tradition says in the past the whole group had an experience, and it's a landmark experience. It's an experience that will change the life of the nation. There isn't a single known tradition like that that is false. Some are hard to test or impossible to test. Others are capable of being tested. Every one that we've been able to test turns out to be true. Now, since the experience at Sinai is delivered by such a tradition that our nation had for thousands of years, and it's a tradition about something that happened to everyone. If you have a picture that Moses went up a mountain and told us what God told him, that's true in part. He did that a lot. But there was also the revelation of the 10 so-called commandments or pronouncements, and that everybody heard. The text is absolutely explicit about that. In at least 6 places it says we all heard God speaking from the mountain. So that means that we have this national spiritual tradition, and it's a national spiritual tradition is a kind of information. That kind of information has never been known to fail. When you look at the myths that other nations believe in, many nations believe many false things. But I have done considerable historical survey, and I have had hundreds of emails showering me with counterexamples. And in every case, the writer has had to admit that it's not a genuine counterexample. So I'm quite confident about this, though you may know something that I'm not aware of, that there aren't any known NETs known to be false. That means if someone wants to say that our tradition is false, he's grasping at a straw. This is the kind of information which we never have seen to fail, and he wants to say, but this is the one place where it failed. You know, you can say what you like, but that's appealing to a mere possibility, not appealing to something for which we have any evidence. And therefore, I think it's defeated by the experience of all mankind that they don't make this kind of mistake. That's the core of the argument. I will present it again at greater length. Some hands were up. You have a question?
Yes. What about national traditions of places like North Korea, Soviet Russia, Communist China? Traditions where, I don't know, the great infallible Kim Jong-un is, a demigod, and Kim Jong-il is still technically alive somewhere. That's also a national tradition. That's something believed by a bunch of people that don't hear otherwise.
Okay, let's go through the criteria. Is it a national tradition? I think we could grant that. Does the national tradition describe a national experience? A national experience? Does the national tradition say that this monster flew over the country on a Sunday afternoon and everybody saw him in the whole country? They say that? That would be a national experience. But they don't say that. They say he's a god. There's no experience of that. There's no way you can detect that. There's no way that you can observe that. You say it so you believe it. That's free because it's not a national experience. There are lots of national traditions about myths, lots of national traditions about things which can't be checked because they can't be experienced. In the Iliad, you have the great war between the Greeks and the Trojans. Achilles, the leader of the Greeks, goes up a mountain and has a conference with Pallas Athene, one of the Greek gods. And he comes out and says, Palestine told us to do X, Y, Z. Next chapter is a big battle. And the text says, the goddess, Palestine, comes down in her chariot and fights among the Greeks, right there in the battlefield. Only, says the author, only, she goes by so fast, all you see is the dust. He's clever, the author. He made sure to write it in such a way that the fighters don't see her. Because then you'd have a public appearance. No, she's on the field, but you can't see her because the dust hides her. Good. That's how it's done. It's always done by making the belief about something which is private or individual or small scale, and then it doesn't fit my criterion. Now, you may ask, why did I make my criterion the way I did? I will explain that. But I'm giving you the bottom line. The bottom line is, that's the criterion I'm using. This is a kind of information which has always been shown to be accurate when we can show anything. Sometimes pieces of history can't be verified or falsified at all. But when they can be, this always turns out to be true. So to say that this one is the one that's false is grasping at straws, yeah.
Can you give another example of an NET?
Sure. The Peloponnesian Wars and the wars of ancient Rome, the accounts come down to us from these kinds of sources. The invention of various types of technology. We know that the Greeks invented steam power. They just used it for toys. They didn't think of using it for industry, but we know that they invented steam power. These are things which are entities and which are accepted by historians as valid. If you ask, how can we possibly check an NET? One thing you can do is check whether the sources on it are consistent. Another thing you could do is check whether other nations bordering have a similar story. They have a story of a war. Well, they fought a war with somebody. Does the other nation also have a story of the war? You can check it archaeologically. If the story says that they used bows and arrows, and you know the bows and arrows didn't exist at that time, then you know something's wrong with the story. There are ways to check these NETs, and in every case where we've been able to check an NET, it's turned out to be true. That means it has a 100% accuracy rate. Yeah.
I would say that the Holocaust, it could be another NET, no? National experience, national tradition. I'm not really sure what the T stands for, but it seems like
National experiential tradition. Yeah, it certainly is. Our belief of the Jewish people is a national experiential tradition about the Holocaust. That's correct. And of course, the Holocaust did happen, right? We're not in doubt about that, are we? No. Okay.
The other question was, you mentioned that it says 6 times explicitly that we all saw God speak. Where are these 6 times in the Torah?
In the Torah. 1 in Exodus and 5 in the beginning of the Sefer Torah, Book of Deuteronomy. If you like, I can show them to you. Yeah.
Is there historical proof of this outside of the Torah, or is it only the validity that exists within this claims established by the Torah?
Okay. Now, first of all, I want to make sure that I understand what you mean.
Yes.
And then, secondly, think back to the ship example. Remember, I'm not using the tradition to verify the tradition. That's not what I'm doing. That would really be bad. I'm supposed to be a logician. You can't assume what you're trying to prove. That's called begging the question. I'm talking about human traditions everywhere. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, the Nigerians, all over the world. I'm looking at their NETs, and I want to know whether ever, anywhere in the world, has an NET been demonstrated to be false. Right? I'm not using the tradition to support the tradition. All I get from our tradition is a story. Okay, so we have this story. What's the reliability of the story? My answer is, check whether people in the world get these stories wrong. If they never get these stories wrong, so far as we know, then I can trust our story as well. It's not using the tradition to back up the tradition. That's not what I'm doing. Now, you asked whether there's other evidence. This is a crucial point. When you start looking for other evidence, and you don't find it, and you think that maybe there's a problem, you're relying on an assumption which you really ought to put on the table. And the assumption is, if it really happened, then I should find evidence. When you put that assumption on the table, you'll find that often it's very hard to justify. Why should I find it? And why should I find it where I'm looking for it? Let's take, for example, the Exodus. Exodus was a world, shattered an empire. Right? Do the Egyptians have any record of it? Let's say they didn't. I think they do, but let's say they didn't. Did any ancient nation describe its failures? The answer is no. They never described their failures. So we would expect the Egyptians not to record it. What about the Assyrians? Did they record it? Did any nation ever describe the battles and successes and failures of 2 other nations? No, they didn't do that. The purpose of history in those times was to glorify the leaders in power. We have, for example, Sennacherib's memoirs. Sennacherib was a great conqueror. Sennacherib's memoirs read like this. I surrounded the city, I besieged the city, I broke down the walls, I defeated the army, and I looted the city. City after city after city. Comes to Jerusalem, so I surrounded the city, I locked up the king of Judah like a bird in a cage, end of entry. Then he goes on to the next city, surrounded the city, broke down the walls, defeated the army, and looted the city. What happened? Well, in Jerusalem, he failed. He was defeated. He doesn't write that. He writes the good part. They surrounded it, locked up the king of Judah like in a cage, and then when he lost the battle, so then he just leaves that out and goes on to the next thing. So you ask, where are other accounts of the fact that the Egyptian empire crumbled in front of us and we left? You don't have any accounts of such events anywhere in any type of ancient history. So this is that hidden assumption that they put on the table. If it were true, I should find this information. Look and see whether this sort of information exists anywhere. If it doesn't, then there's no surprise that you don't find it. Yeah.
Surely things like natural disasters or things explained by the 10 plagues would be not seen as a failure, rather as a natural occurrence. So why wouldn't momentous events like this have been recorded in history?
First of all, plagues and shortage of rainfall and so forth and so on were typically not recorded, number one. But number two, if you have a fellow who presents himself as a prophet and he predicts each one, in ancient times, as it would be today as well, if somebody can predict them, he gets credibility. And then it isn't seen just as a natural, and so come one on top of the other in a single year. Now, as a matter of fact, there is a quote from an Egyptian priest in the 2nd century BCE. That's 1,000 years after the events. And he says the Jews were slaves in Egypt. And he says, we kicked them out because they were leprous. So he admits that we were slaves there, and he admits there was an exodus. He just puts a spin on it, that they kicked us out. So when I read that, I thought, okay, he's entitled to his spin. He's representing the Egyptian point of view. Then I thought to myself, wait a minute. That's not really so much of a spin. Because what happened? What happened was that night the firstborn were starting to die. And the Egyptians did come to the Jewish people, and they did kick them out. The Torah tells us they kicked them out. They didn't want to leave so quickly. They pushed them out, and they said, leave because kulonu mason, we're all going to die. So 1,000 years later, you have a priest who's telling the story pretty much the way it happened. Okay, he said leprosy, and it wasn't leprosy. But aside from that, that's a record 1,000 years later. But he's not an official historian. It wasn't the king who had the hieroglyphics put up in stone where it will be there forever that we were bested and we lost the battles to so-and-so. That didn't happen. So that being the case, the fact that it isn't there is not surprising to us. When you're asking for ancient evidence, always think, why do I think the evidence should be there for me to find it where I'm looking? If you can't give a reason for that, then when you don't find it, it's not significant. And this is where they say absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Clever, hey? You think about that over a cup of coffee. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's not always true, but it's often true. Yeah.
A lot of the NETs you're talking about, they're a lot more modern. What makes you believe that we can extrapolate the truth of the NETs way back to like 12, whenever Exodus happens?
You don't mean the NET. The NET is the tradition. That tradition exists up until, let's say, 300 years ago. That tradition existed for thousands of years. The tradition existed for thousands of years. What you're talking about is the experience described in the tradition. So now the question is whether traditions of this type reflect real experiences that people had, or they don't reflect real experiences that people had. So as far back as we can trace national experiential traditions to times when people were very superstitious and believed in all sorts of monsters and all sorts of impossibilities, this sort of mistake was never made. If you want to say that as far back as we can go, this mistake was never made, but I think further back it was made, I would like to see evidence. I'd like to see evidence of some kind of discontinuity in the way in which cultures developed. I don't think that you can just assume that. You use the evidence that you have. And all the evidence that we have, cultures don't make this kind of mistake all over the world. Okay, now, one last thing to say, and I'm going to finish for today. someone will ask, okay, you cooked up this criterion. You cooked up this idea, NETs, and you checked them, but you made it up. What made you think of that particular type of tradition? Why is that an important category? Maybe it's just made up for the sake of the argument. The reason I chose it is because of a book called The Kuzari, written by Rabbi Yehuda Levi 1,000 years ago. He gave me the inspiration for it. I call it the Kuzari Principle. If you look it up on the net, you can see hundreds of pages on the Kuzari Principle. And he asked the following question. Imagine that you're trying to make up a false story and sell it to people. You want to tell them something happened. They don't know about it because it didn't happen. But you're making it up and you want to persuade them that it happened. Sometimes it'll be easy. I make up a false story about what happened in Midland China 750 years ago. I can easily get people to believe that if I'm persuasive, if I'm tall, handsome, good at football, the kinds of things that give people credibility. But if I try to tell you a story about your ancestors, what happened to your ancestors, it's going to be harder. Because you're going to say, listen, you're telling me what happened to our ancestors. Then how come I don't know about it? What happened to the information? You're talking about my great-great-great-grandfather and all of our great-great-great-grandfathers. So what happened? Everybody just forgot about it? But we don't know what happened in China. That's quite understandable. So I have to decide to trust you or not. But if you're going to tell me, now, I don't know, somebody from San Francisco, suppose somebody tried to say that 175 years ago, there was an earthquake in San Francisco which leveled every house in the city, and the whole city had to be rebuilt. No one living in San Francisco today is going to buy that story. Because he's going to say, I'm living here. All the people that are around me are living here. Many of them are living here for generations. No one ever heard of that. If that really happened, we'd all know about it. It'll be part of the history of the city. We teach it in our schools. We have books about it. It's just not credible. So it all depends upon the kind of story you're making up. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Levi said, imagine coming to a group of people and saying, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, all of your ancestors heard God speak, all heard it simultaneously, and he gave them a Torah and gave them a set of commandments, and it didn't happen. And they've never heard of this. Are they going to buy that? I think they're going to just be incredulous. That sort of thing is the thing you forget over the evening soccer scores. You don't lose track of it when you're making your morning coffee. If that really happened, we should know about it. Therefore, you're not going to be able to convince people that it happened. That's what the Kuzari says. Well, when I read that in the 20th century, and now dripping over into the 21st century, I've come across people who say, who said so? I think you could make it up. I think you could convince people, feed them a little mescaline, and dance around the fire, and maybe if he's a priest and they think he has supernatural abilities, I don't know, I think you could make people believe it. Now what am I going to say? I don't think so, and he does think so, so that's a stalemate. That's why I made the empirical survey about these traditions. My argument is not based on the intuition that people won't accept it. That's an intuition. I think it's reasonable. I think it's pretty solid. But somebody else who doesn't share it, what am I going to say? My intuition is better than your intuition? That's not an argument. It might be true, but it's not an argument. So I did an empirical survey to see whether this type of story, which intuitively you can't convince people of, whether, in fact, in human experience, this type of story is reliable or not. When I find that in human experience, this type of story is reliable, that's the evidence that this type of story is true. And even though it's still possible that it's a mistake, that's only a possibility. And as I said at the beginning, in the middle, and towards the end, I'm giving away possibilities. They're free. And I think all the evidence that we have is evidence that it's true. And that being the case, we have adequate evidence to believe that it's a real historical event. Okay, that's the summary, the précis. And tomorrow I'll do a complete review of it, and then we'll discuss it as much as you like. And then next week we'll carry on with further applications.